My neighbor built a fence through the middle of my garden claiming half my property was hers based on research. I made her life hell. I bought my house 3 years ago after saving for almost a decade. It sat on 2 acres in a quiet area outside town. The previous owner was an elderly man who moved to be closer to his kids. He kept the property nice, and I planned to do the same. I had a garden in the back, a little workshop I built myself, and plenty of space to just exist without anyone bothering me. For the first year, I didn't have any problems. My neighbor on the left was an older couple who waved when they saw me and minded their own business. My neighbor on the right was a woman named Jolene, who moved in about 6 months after I did. She seemed friendly at first. She came over with a pie when she moved in and told me she was excited to live somewhere peaceful after years in the city. I thanked her for the pie and figured we'd be the kind of neighbors who waved and occasionally chatted about the weather. I was wrong. The problem started when I put up a small fence around my garden to keep deer out. Jolene came over the same day and asked why I was building on her property. I told her the garden was a good 30 feet from the property line and showed her the survey markers the previous owner had pointed out when I bought the place. She looked at the markers and said they were wrong. She said the actual property line was much closer to my house and that everything past my driveway belonged to her. I laughed because I thought she was joking. Jolene told me she had done her own research and the land records were messed up. She said the previous owner had been using her family's land for years without permission and she was just taking back what was rightfully hers. I asked what research she did. She said she talked to some people in town who remembered her grandmother owning land out here decades ago. I told her that wasn't how property ownership worked. She told me I was being difficult and walked away. I figured that was the end of it. It wasn't. A week later, Jolene put up her own fence, right through the middle of my garden. She ran it from her property line straight across my yard, cutting my 2 acres nearly in half. I came home from work and found my tomato plants on the other side of her fence. I walked over and asked what she was doing. She said she was protecting her property from trespassers. I told her she just destroyed 3 months of work. She said I shouldn't have been gardening on her land. I called the county office the next morning. They confirmed my property lines were exactly where the survey markers said they were. Jolene's claim had no legal standing. I told Jolene this and showed her the paperwork. She said the county was corrupt and in the pocket of developers who wanted to steal land from real families. She refused to take down her fence. Things escalated from there. Jolene started using my land like it was hers. She set up lawn chairs on my side of the fence. She let her dog run around my yard. She even started a small vegetable garden right where mine used to be. When I told her to stop, she said I was harassing her. She told other neighbors I was trying to force her off land her family had owned for generations. Some of them believed her because she cried when she told the story. I got dirty looks at the grocery store from people I'd never even spoken to. Jolene called the police twice saying I was trespassing on her property. Both times the officers looked at the actual records and told her she had no claim. Both times she cried and said the system was rigged against working families. The officers told me there wasn't much they could do unless I wanted to pursue legal action. I didn't want to spend money on lawyers for someone who would probably just ignore a court order anyway. So I got creative. First I took down her fence. I waited until she was at work and removed every single post. I stacked the materials neatly on her actual property with a note explaining that she had built on my land without permission and I was returning her supplies. She came over screaming that I had destroyed her property. I told her I just moved it to where it belonged. She put the fence back up the next day. I took it down again that night. We did this 4 times before she finally stopped rebuilding. Then I made her life inconvenient in small ways. Jolene had been using a shortcut through my property to get to the main road. Saved her about 5 minutes every morning. I put up posts and rope blocking that path. She had to drive the long way around for the first time since she moved in. She complained to anyone who would listen that I was being petty. I told people she had tried to steal half my land and they could decide who was being unreasonable. The older couple on my left had seen the whole thing unfold. They started telling people what actually happened. Marshall and Delphine had been my only allies in this mess. They'd watched Jolene's fence go up through my garden and seen me take it down 4 times. They knew the truth, and now they were telling people around town what actually happened instead of letting Jolene's sob story spread unchecked. I appreciated it more than I could say, but the damage was already done in a lot of ways. The next morning I walked outside to leave for work and found Jolene's car parked at an angle that cut across the edge of my driveway, not completely blocking it, but positioned, so I had to maneuver carefully around the bumper to get out. She'd left just enough space that I couldn't call it a full obstruction, but it forced me to back up twice and angle my truck at a weird position to avoid scraping her paint. I took photos with my phone before I left, making sure to capture the timestamp and the way her car sat half on my property. When I got home that evening, her car was in the same spot. I took more photos. The pattern continued for 3 days straight. Every morning her car sat there forcing me to navigate around it, and every evening I documented it with new pictures. Jolene was retaliating for the blocked shortcut, making my life difficult in the same petty way I'd made hers difficult. I could have confronted her, but I decided documentation was more useful than another screaming match. I called the county property records office and asked who they recommended for official boundary surveys. The clerk gave me the name Harvey Kent and said he was reliable and thorough. I called Harvey that afternoon and explained the situation without going into too much detail about about the fence wars. He said he could come out the following week to do a complete survey with permanent markers. The cost was $300, which hurt my wallet, but seemed worth it to have undeniable legal proof of where my property actually ended. Harvey explained that his survey would create official documentation that would hold up in any legal proceeding. I scheduled the appointment and felt relieved that I'd finally have something more concrete than old survey markers that Jolene kept insisting were wrong. The following week, Harvey showed up with his equipment and started measuring. I watched from my porch as he set up his transit and began marking points around the property line. About 20 minutes into the work, Jolene came storming across her yard, demanding to know what was happening. Harvey stayed calm and explained he was conducting an official county survey to establish the legal boundaries. He showed her the property records he'd brought with him, the same documents that proved my ownership. Jolene looked at the papers and then at Harvey's equipment and said his tools must be broken or miscalibrated. She insisted there was no way the property line was where he was marking it, because her grandmother had owned all this land decades ago. Harvey told her politely that property ownership was based on recorded deeds and legal transfers, not family stories. Jolene refused to accept it and stood there arguing until Harvey told her she was interfering with official county business. She went back to her house but kept watching from her window the entire time he worked. 2 days later, I stopped at the hardware store to pick up supplies for fixing my workshop door. The owner rang up my purchase and mentioned casually that he'd heard I was the guy stealing that poor woman's family land. I stopped loading my wallet and looked at him. He seemed uncomfortable suddenly, like he realized he'd said something awkward. I asked him what he'd heard exactly. He said Jolene had been in the store multiple times over the past few weeks, telling anyone who would listen that I was forcing her off property her family had owned for generations. She'd cried while telling the story, he said, and it seemed real. I realized then that Jolene hadn't just been spreading her version around the neighborhood. She'd been going to every business in town, painting herself as the victim of theft instead of someone who'd built a fence through my garden and tried to claim half my land. I started carrying copies of my property deed and Harvey's survey results everywhere I went. The documents stayed in my truck in a folder, and whenever someone mentioned Jolene's claims, I pulled them out and showed the official proof. At the grocery store, at the gas station, at the diner where I got breakfast on weekends. I watched people's faces change as they read the county records and realized they'd been misled. Some apologized, others just looked embarrassed and changed the subject. A few seemed annoyed that I was contradicting a story they'd already accepted as true. 3 weeks after Harvey finished the survey, I got a letter from the town council. Jolene had filed a formal complaint claiming my fence removal and path blocking constituted harassment. The letter required me to attend a mediation session the following Tuesday evening. I read it twice and felt my frustration spike. I was treated like the problem when all I'd done was defend my legal property from someone who'd literally built a fence through my garden. The mediation session was held in a small conference room at the town hall. Jolene sat on one side of the table with the mediator between us. I brought my folder of documents and laid everything out. The survey results showing the exact property boundaries, my deed proving ownership, photos of Jolene's fence cutting through my garden with my destroyed tomato plants visible in the pictures. The mediator reviewed everything carefully while Jolene sat silent. After 10 minutes, he looked at Jolene and told her directly that she had no legal claim to any part of my property. The records were clear and the survey was official. But then he suggested we work out a neighborly compromise to keep the peace in the community. I asked what kind of compromise he had in mind. He suggested maybe I could let Jolene use the shortcut path a few days a week, or allow her to keep a small garden plot on my land as a goodwill gesture. I refused immediately. I told him I'd already spent $300 on the survey and lost an entire season's garden to Jolene's fence. I wasn't surrendering use of my own land just to make her feel better about being wrong. The mediator seemed disappointed in my inflexibility. He said sometimes being right wasn't as important as being neighborly. I told him I'd tried being neighborly when Jolene first moved in, and she'd responded by claiming half my property and calling me a thief around town. He ended the session by saying we should both try to be more considerate going forward. That evening, Marshall and Delphine showed up at my door with a casserole and sympathy. Delphine said they'd started correcting Jolene's story whenever they heard it mentioned around town. Marshall told me he'd watched the whole fence situation unfold from his kitchen window, and he was tired of hearing lies about what actually happened. He'd told people at church the real version, and Delphine had done the same at her book club. They were spreading the truth the same way Jolene had spread her fiction, and slowly people were starting to realize who was actually in the wrong. I thanked them and meant it. 2 days later, I came home from work to find a massive pile of landscaping rocks dumped right on the property line near my driveway. The pile sat partially on Jolene's side, but jutted out enough to make backing out of my driveway difficult. I got out of my truck and stared at the rocks. There had to be 2 tons of them sitting there, positioned perfectly to inconvenience me while technically being on her property. When I looked over at Jolene's house, she was standing in her yard watching. She called out that she was improving her property with some landscaping work. I didn't respond. I just took more photos and added them to my growing collection of documentation. I spent the next morning looking for legal help. I found Scarlett Meadows in a small office above the pharmacy on Main Street. She specialized in property property disputes and had good reviews online. Her office was neat and organized with case files stacked in labeled boxes along one wall. I brought my folder of documentation and spread everything across her desk. The survey results from Harvey, my property deed, photos of Jolene's fence cutting through my garden, the timestamps showing her car blocking my driveway. Scarlett reviewed each document carefully and made notes on a yellow legal pad. She asked questions about the timeline and took down exact dates for everything that had happened. After 30 minutes, she set down her pen and explained my options. I could pursue a restraining order to keep Jolene off my property. I could sue for damages to recover the cost of my destroyed garden and the survey fees. I could file for harassment based on her repeated false claims and the driveway obstruction. All of it sounded reasonable until she started talking about costs. A restraining order would require court filings and at least 2 hearings. Legal fees would run between $3,000 and $5,000, depending on how much Jolene fought it. A lawsuit for damages would cost even more and could take 6 months to a year to resolve. And even if I won, there was no guarantee Jolene would actually pay or comply with any court order. Scarlett said she'd seen cases where people were ignored, judgments for years, and enforcement became its own expensive battle. I thanked her for her time and paid the consultation fee. Walking back to my truck, I felt frustrated, but also clear about what I needed to do. Spending thousands of dollars and months in court wasn't going to fix this problem. Jolene had already shown she didn't care about official documentation or legal boundaries. A court order would just be another piece of paper for her to ignore while I went broke trying to enforce it. 3 weeks later, the town held its annual spring festival in the park near the library. I normally avoided community events, but Marshall had convinced me to rent a booth to sell some furniture I'd been building in my workshop. I set up Saturday morning with my tables and chairs displayed on a blue tarp. The festival had decent turnout with families walking between booths and kids running around with cotton candy. I was talking to a customer about a coffee table when I noticed Jolene 2 booths down. She was selling baked goods with prices written on index cards. Our booths were close enough that we could hear each other's conversations. For the first hour, we both pretended the other didn't exist. Then Jolene started making comments. Not directed at me exactly, but loud enough that I could hear every word. She told a customer about how hard it was to build a business when people in town tried to steal your family's land. She mentioned property thieves who thought they could push around honest working people. She said some folks had no respect for history or family legacy. I kept my mouth shut and focused on my customers. A woman buying 2 chairs asked if I was the one involved in that property dispute she'd heard about. I showed her my survey documentation and explained briefly what had actually happened. She looked over at Jolene's booth and back at me and said she'd heard a very different version of events. By early afternoon, several people had noticed the tension between our booths. A man I recognized from the hardware store stopped by and asked outright what was going on. I explained that Jolene had built a fence through my garden claiming half my property based on stories about her grandmother. I showed him the official county records proving my ownership. He looked uncomfortable and said he'd heard Jolene's side first and hadn't realized there was documentation proving otherwise. More people started asking questions as the day went on. I stopped trying to sell furniture and just answered honestly about what had happened. Some people already knew the truth from Marshall and Delphine. Others were hearing the real version for the first time and seemed surprised that official records contradicted everything Jolene had told them. I decided that week to stop fighting individual battles and just end the whole situation permanently. I called a fencing company and got quotes for installing a proper privacy fence along the entire property line. The cost made me wince. $6,000 for materials and labor to fence the whole boundary between my property and Jolene's, but it would solve multiple problems at once. It would mark the legal boundary clearly, so there could be no confusion about where my land ended and hers began. It would prevent Jolene from easily accessing my property or watching my activities. It would give me actual privacy instead of constant surveillance. I wrote the check and scheduled the installation for the following week. The crew showed up on a Monday morning with posts and panels loaded on a flatbed truck. They worked efficiently, setting posts in concrete and attaching the 6-foot panels. The fence ran straight along the survey markers Harvey had placed. I watched them work and felt something loosen in my chest. This was my land. These were the legal boundaries, and now there would be a physical barrier making that undeniable. Jolene came outside when the crew started working near her yard. She stood watching from her porch with her arms crossed. The crew foreman showed her the survey documentation proving they were building on the correct property line. She didn't argue, but she didn't go back inside either. She just stood there watching as the fence went up section by section. On the 3rd day of installation, I happened to look over at Jolene's house and saw her standing at her kitchen window. She wasn't watching the crew with anger like before. She looked tired, really tired, the kind of exhausted that comes from more than just lack of sleep. Her shoulders were slumped, and she had dark circles under her eyes that I could see even from a distance. She noticed me looking and moved away from the window. That afternoon, I was in my garden replanting the area where her fence had been when I heard her voice from the other side of my new fence. She was on the phone and talking loud enough that her voice carried. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but I couldn't help overhearing. She was talking about money, something about bills she couldn't pay, and a payment plan she was trying to set up. Then she mentioned her ex-husband, and her voice got got sharp and angry. She said something about him taking everything in the divorce and leaving her with nothing but debt. I stood there holding a tomato plant and realized I'd been so focused on the property dispute that I'd never thought about why Jolene was so obsessed with claiming my land. Maybe it wasn't really about the property at all. Maybe it was about feeling like she'd lost control of everything else in her life, and this was the one thing she thought she could fight for and win. The next week, I was getting my mail when I saw a postal worker deliver a certified letter to Jolene's door. She had to sign for it, and I saw her face when she looked at the envelope. She went pale. I didn't know what the letter said, but I could tell it was bad news. Over the next several days, I noticed changes in Jolene's behavior. Her yard started looking messier. Weeds grew up around her mailbox, and her lawn went uncut. Her car stayed in the driveway more than usual, like she wasn't going to work as regularly. Most noticeably, she stopped monitoring me. She didn't come outside when I was in my yard. She didn't watch from her windows. She didn't make comments or create new problems. Whatever that certified letter had contained, it had become a much bigger issue than our property dispute. I felt a strange mix of relief and something almost like concern. The relief made sense. The constant conflict had been exhausting, and now it was just stopping on its own without me having to do anything. But the concern surprised me. I didn't like Jolene, and I hadn't forgiven her for the months of harassment and lies. But seeing her completely fall apart made me realize she was dealing with problems I knew nothing about. Things shifted in town after that. The combination of my permanent fence, Harvey's official survey markers, and Marshall and Delphine's consistent testimony finally changed how people saw the situation. The hardware store owner stopped me one morning and apologized. He said he'd believed Jolene's story at first because she'd seemed so genuine when she told it. But after seeing the actual documentation and hearing from people who'd witnessed everything, he realized he'd been wrong about what happened. Other people mentioned they'd heard the real version of events now. The woman at the post office said Delphine had explained the whole timeline at book club. A guy I saw at the gas station said Marshall had shown him the survey results at church. Slowly, the narrative in town corrected itself. People stopped giving me dirty looks at the grocery store. The gossip shifted from me being a property thief to Jolene having made false claims based on family stories that had no legal standing. I didn't feel victorious exactly, just tired and ready for it all to be over. On a Thursday evening about 3 weeks after the fence installation, someone knocked on my door. I opened it and found Jolene standing on my porch. She looked different from I'd ever seen her. No anger in her face, no determination or righteousness, just defeat. She asked if we could talk. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. We stood there on my porch in the evening light, and she said she thought maybe we should agree to disagree about the property history. She didn't apologize. She didn't admit she'd been wrong, but she suggested we just leave each other alone going forward. She said she was tired of fighting and she had other things to deal with now. I could tell from her voice that whatever those other things were, they were serious. I told her I'd leave her alone as long as she stayed off my property and stopped spreading lies about me in town. I said I didn't need her friendship or her apology, but I was tired of the constant conflict. If she could maintain actual boundaries and stop the harassment, I was willing to accept peaceful coexistence. She nodded and said that was fair. We stood there for another moment without anything else to say. Then she walked back to her house and I went inside. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't friendship. It was just two people who lived next door agreeing to stop making each other's lives harder. We worked out the details over the next few days through brief conversations. Neither of us would cross the fence line onto the other's property. Neither of us would discuss the other around town or bring up the dispute with neighbors. We would communicate only when absolutely necessary and keep it civil and brief. It wasn't the neighborly relationship I'd hoped for when I bought the house. It wasn't even particularly friendly, but it was functional. It created clear boundaries that let us both use our properties without daily warfare. I could garden without worrying about fences appearing overnight. I could leave for work without checking if my driveway was blocked. I could exist on my own land without constant surveillance and harassment. Jolene could do whatever she needed to do on her property without me retaliating or creating new problems. It was detachment, functional detachment that replaced the toxic engagement we'd been stuck in for months. The first 2 weeks of the new arrangement felt tense. I caught myself watching her yard more than I wanted to admit, checking to see if she was respecting the boundaries or if this was just another temporary truce before the next escalation. But she stayed on her side of the fence. I stayed on mine. We saw each other occasionally when we were both outside, but we didn't speak beyond brief nods. Gradually, I stopped checking her yard every time I went outside. I stopped thinking about what she might be doing or planning. I focused on my own property and my own life, and let her deal with whatever problems she was facing. The fence stood solid and clear between our properties. The survey markers proved the legal boundaries, and the daily conflict that had dominated months of my life just faded into cautious distance. Marshall stopped by a few days later while I was working in the garden. He mentioned that people around town had mostly moved on to other things. The gossip about the property dispute had faded into background noise. He said most folks now understood what actually happened after he and Delphine kept setting the record straight. Some people still gave me the cold shoulder at the hardware store or the post office. A few of Jolene's early supporters never quite came around to believing the truth. They had picked their side based on her tears and dramatic stories, and admitting they were wrong would mean facing the fact that they had treated me badly for no reason. I accepted that some relationships in town were just broken. You can't force people to acknowledge facts when they have already decided what they want to believe. Marshall told me not to worry about those few holdouts. He said time would handle the rest, and anyone who mattered knew the real story now. 3 months passed, and I realized one morning that I hadn't thought about Jolene in days. I was drinking coffee on my back porch and looking at the garden I had replanted. The tomatoes were coming in strong. The beans were climbing their stakes. Everything looked healthy and normal. I had my property back, and I could actually enjoy it without constant anger or vigilance. The whole mess had cost me nearly $2,000 between the survey, the fence installation, and the destroyed garden from earlier in the year. It had cost me months of peace and sleep. It had made me suspicious of people in ways I never was before. I used to take folks at their word and assume good intentions. Now I documented everything and kept copies of important papers in 3 different places. I trusted less and verified more. But I had also learned that I could stand up for myself when someone tried to take advantage. I had learned that being right sometimes requires being stubborn and refusing to back down even when it would be easier to just give up some ground for the sake of peace. I saw Jolene outside occasionally when we were both doing yard work or getting the mail. We would exchange brief nods, nothing more. She had started her own small garden on her actual property, staying well within her boundaries. I had replanted mine where it belonged. We existed next to each other like 2 strangers who happened to share a property line. There was no friendship. There was no real acknowledgement of what had happened between us. We just occupied our separate spaces and went about our separate lives. Sometimes I would see her kneeling in her garden pulling weeds, and I would remember the version of her who brought me a pie when she first moved in. That person felt like someone from a completely different timeline. The woman across the fence now was someone I barely knew and had no interest in knowing better. My property was secure. The fence marked clear legal boundaries that no one could dispute. The survey document sat in a fireproof safe in my workshop, with copies at my lawyer's office and in a safety deposit box at the bank. I could use every inch of my 2 acres without worrying about someone claiming it belonged to them. I could plant whatever I wanted, build whatever I needed, and enjoy the space I had worked a decade to afford. But I kept the survey maps handy, and I stayed alert. The situation had taught me that winning sometimes looks different from you expect. I had kept my property and established my rights, but I had lost the quiet, peaceful neighborhood I thought I was buying. I had won the legal battle, but accepted that the cost was living next door to someone I would never trust or speak to beyond basic civility. Sometimes the best resolution you can get is keeping what belongs to you while accepting that some things stay broken.